In the summer of 1908, a forest the size of a major city was destroyed in seconds, and the world's scientists would not stand at the edge of it for 19 years. Not because the explosion was small. It was, by conservative modern estimates, 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Not because no one noticed. They noticed. The sky turned red over London. Barometers swung in Washington. Seismic stations across Europe recorded the shockwave passing twice around the globe. Everyone felt it. No one went to look. The date was June 30th, 1908. The location, the Podkamenaya Tunguska River Basin in central Siberia, one of the most remote and least mapped regions on Earth. The nearest settlement of any size was Vanavara, a small trading post, roughly 60 kilometers from the epicenter. At approximately 7:15 in the morning, local time, witnesses there reported a column of bluish light moving across the sky as bright as the sun. Then a flash. Then a pressure wave that shattered windows and knocked people off their feet. Then silence. The Evenki people lived in and around that forest. They were semi-nomadic reindeer herders, and in June of 1908, several groups were camped within range of the blast. Accounts collected years later describe tents being thrown into the air, reindeer scattering in panic, and a heat so sudden and intense that one man reportedly felt his shirt catch fire before the shockwave knocked him unconscious. He was roughly 60 kilometers from the epicenter. These accounts differ in details. They were recalled years after the fact, in a language few Russian officials spoke, but their core consistency is striking. Within weeks, Russian newspapers ran brief reports. Witnesses in Kansk, Kirinsk, and Nizhny Ilimsk, towns hundreds of kilometers away, described the flash and the trembling ground. The Trans-Siberian Railway had reportedly stopped a train, its crew fearing a derailment. Leonid Kulik, then a young mineralogist working for the Russian Imperial Meteorological Institute, later recalled reading those early reports. He found them intriguing. He filed them away. Russia in 1908 was a country managing a revolution in the recent past and another building in its near future. A mysterious explosion in central Siberia was not officially a priority. The years that followed erased rather than preserved. World War I consumed the scientific infrastructure of the Russian Empire. The 1917 revolution dissolved the institutions Kulik worked within and rebuilt them under different names with different priorities. The early Soviet state was focused on industrialization, electrification, collectivization, the transformation of a nation from the ground up. An unexplained event in an uninhabited forest, witnessed primarily by indigenous people whose testimony existed in no official archive, did not fit neatly into any of those projects. 19 years passed. The trees stayed fallen. The Evenki stayed silent, not because they had nothing to say, but because nobody asked. It was Leonid Kulik who finally refused to let it go. By the mid-1920s, he had become the senior meteorite specialist at the Mineralogical Museum in St. Petersburg, then renamed Leningrad. He had spent years assembling the fragmented newspaper accounts, the seismic records, the eyewitness letters that had drifted into scientific correspondence and then been forgotten. In 1921, the Soviet Academy of Sciences gave him a mandate to survey Siberia for meteorite falls. He used it. He began quietly building a case that whatever had fallen in 1908 was the largest meteoritic event in recorded history. He needed one thing: to actually go there. Getting there was its own ordeal. In February 1927, Kulik finally departed Leningrad on the Trans-Siberian Railway. He traveled to Taishet, then by horse-drawn sledge north into the taiga. The journey to Vanavara took weeks. Roads, in any practical sense, did not exist. The landscape was frozen, the trails unmarked, the distances between settlements vast enough to kill a poorly prepared traveler. When Kulik reached Vanavara and began asking about the 1908 event, he found that the local population remembered it with precision. They had been remembering it for 19 years with no one to tell. The trading post manager warned him not to go further. The Evenki, he said, considered that forest cursed. Kulik pressed on, and what he found when he reached the Tunguska Basin stopped him. He had expected a crater. He expected the classic evidence of a meteorite strike, a depression, metallic fragments, scorched earth radiating from a single point of impact. What he found instead was a forest flattened across roughly 2,000 square kilometers, trees pointing outward in all directions from a central zone. But the central zone itself showed trees still standing, stripped of branches, upright. No crater, no fragments, no buried rock. The explosion, whatever it was, had happened in the air. The implications of that took decades to fully understand. Kulik interviewed witnesses that summer. For the first time, systematically, someone was writing down what the Evenki had seen. One account described a man named Vasily Ocheredin, who was plowing a field near Kejma, roughly 200 kilometers from the epicenter, and was thrown from his horse by the shockwave. Other accounts came from hunters who had been in the forest itself and described a heat and sound they had no frame of reference for. Some spoke of a second explosion following the first. Accounts differ on details, as Kulik himself noted, but the consistency across dozens of independent witnesses, speaking from memory nearly 2 decades later, was something no skeptic could easily dismiss. Kulik returned to Leningrad and published his initial findings in 1927. He mounted 3 more expeditions to the Tunguska site, in 1928, 1929, and 1930. He never found a crater. He never found meteorite fragments. He died in 1942 in a German prisoner of war camp, still without a definitive answer to what had happened. The scientific debate that followed his death ran for decades. Comet, asteroid, a fragment of antimatter. Proposals accumulated. The current consensus, built on computational modeling and decades of data, points to a small asteroid or comet nucleus that exploded roughly 5 to 10 kilometers above the surface. But consensus arrived long after the witnesses were gone. What the 19-year silence cost is difficult to measure precisely. The trees that fell in 1908 were still identifiable in 1927. The witnesses were still alive. The physical evidence, whatever it was, had not entirely vanished. But the delay meant no photographs from the days immediately after, no soil samples taken before decades of weather, no measurements of the standing dead trees at the epicenter before they too began to rot. Every year of the silence was a layer of evidence gone. The Evenki testimony, gathered nearly 2 decades late, became the only human record of those first seconds. It was and remains irreplaceable. The Tunguska Event is still studied. Researchers returned to the basin as recently as the 2000s and 2010s, drilling lake sediment cores and running spectral analyses looking for extraterrestrial material. Some findings are promising. None are conclusive. The object itself, whatever it was, left no recoverable fragment. It erased itself on impact. What survived was the shape of the absence, 2,000 square kilometers of fallen trees, and the memory of people who were thrown from their feet by something that had no name in any language they spoke. They waited 19 years for someone to ask. The next story begins where another silence ends.